Good morning. Today we're going over corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. The homework tonight is the worksheet, which are the evens. I'm going to go over the odds as some of my examples. In order to use corresponding parts of congruent triangles congruent, you must prove the triangles are congruent first. What are the ways to prove triangles are congruent? We said there were 5 ways to do that. Show side, side, side. Show side, angle, side. Show angle, side, angle. Show angle, angle, side. And show hypotenuse leg. So you have to prove that triangles are congruent first using one of these 5 ways before you can use corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So up here I have triangle dog is congruent to triangle cat. I know that the corresponding parts are congruent. So DO, segment DO is congruent to CA. OG is congruent to AT. And DG is congruent to CT. So those are the corresponding sides. Corresponding angles are angle D is congruent to angle C. Angle O is congruent to angle A. And angle G is congruent to angle T. So these are the 6 statements that we know if the triangles are congruent and the corresponding parts are congruent and the corresponding angles are congruent. We can use corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent to say that any parts are congruent if the triangles are congruent. The other little theorem I wanted to go over, because we've done it before, but I wanted to remind you, if 2 angles of one triangle are congruent to 2 angles of a second triangle, then the third angles of the triangles are congruent. What does this mean? It means if you have two angles of one triangle congruent to 2 angles of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. So in other words, if this angle is congruent to this angle, and that angle is congruent to this angle, then it follows that the third angles must be congruent. So when do you use corresponding parts of congruent triangles congruent? When do you use Cpctc? Before you can use it, you must show the 2 triangles are congruent. First you have to show the triangles are congruent. Then after you show the triangles are congruent, you can use corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Once again, there are 5 ways to prove that 2 triangles are congruent. Side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, 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 side, and hypotenuse, leg. So you'd have to use one of these first, and then after that, you can use corresponding parts of congruent triangles congruent. So this first, one of these, and then corresponding parts of congruent triangles congruent. So let's start with a proof. And I'll give you a minute to copy it down, the picture. All right. So what are you trying to prove? That's the first question. What are you trying to prove? Are you trying to prove that triangles are congruent, or are you trying to prove that parts of the triangles are congruent? Well, if you look at what you're trying to prove, you're trying to prove that side KL is congruent to side ML. So before you can do that, you have to state that the triangles are congruent. So we're trying to prove, and we don't know how many we're going to have. We're trying to prove this. The only way to do that is to first show, and we're proving it with corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. But first we have to show before that triangle JKL is congruent to triangle JML. We have to prove the triangles are congruent first before we can use corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So let's start with our given information. We have angle K is congruent to angle M. That is given. We'll mark that. Angle K is congruent to angle M. Next we have JK is congruent to JM. So JK is congruent to JM. That's given. Then we have JL bisects angle KLM. That's given. Alright, so if JL bisects KLM, then this is equal to this, and that's equal to this. So we'll say this is angle 1 and this is angle 2. So from this information, we get angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And definition of angle bisector. Okay, so now we can say that triangle JKL is congruent to triangle JML, and what would the reason be? Well, we have an angle, and a side. So we're going to say the reason is angle, side. Because we have shown that those two triangles are congruent, we can go to the next step and say that KL is congruent to ML because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. But we first have to prove this, or say this, before we can use this. So we have to show the triangles are congruent first before we show that any parts are congruent. So ask yourself, what are you trying to prove? Are you trying to prove the triangles are congruent? Or are you trying to prove the parts are congruent? So on this picture, I have triangle DGE and triangle FGE. And once again, you can see that we're trying to prove that side DG is congruent to side FG. We're not trying to prove the triangles are congruent. That's not our final statement. But in order to say this side is congruent to that side, we have to prove the triangles are congruent first. So we'll start with angle D is congruent to angle F, which is given. We'll mark that. Then we're given that GE bisects angle DEF. That's given. So if it bisects DEF, then we know that this angle is equal to that angle. So we'll call this angle 1 and 2. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Definition of angle bisector. What do we know about GE? We know that GE is congruent to itself because of what property? The reflexive property. So we have this side is congruent to itself. So we have an angle, and a side. So we can show that these two triangles are congruent using angle, side. So we're going back up here, and we'll start with angle DEG. Triangle DEG is congruent to triangle FEG. Because of angle, side. From there, since we proved that this triangle DEG is congruent to FEG using angle, side, then we can go to the next step and say that side DG is congruent to FG because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. But if you're proving sides are congruent, then you have to say the triangles are congruent first, using one of the 5 ways we talked about. Sometimes on a problem like this, it's better to yank the picture apart. Let's just start with the given information. And also, what are we trying to prove? We're trying to prove that side KR is congruent to side MP. So down here, our last statement would be KR is congruent to MP and the reason would be corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Before we do that, we're going to have to prove the two triangles are congruent. So we'll go back up here and look at our two triangles. We'd have to say that triangle KPR is congruent to triangle MRP. We'd have to say that first. We don't know what reason, but we would have to say that first. All right, so look, we have angle K is congruent to angle M. That is given. We have that KP is perpendicular to PR. That is given. So we know that angle KPR is a right angle, and we know angle MRP is a right angle, and that would be definition of perpendicular lines. We forgot to put the other one, that PR was perpendicular to MR. Okay. All right. So because they're right angles, we know that angle KPR is congruent to angle MRP, because all right angles are congruent. Do this again. All right angles man. Alright, so all right angles are congruent. So what do we know about PR? PR is in both of these triangles, so we know that PR is equal to itself using what property? The reflexive property. So now I can say triangle KPR is congruent to triangle MRP, and what would be the reason? Well, we have an angle, and a side. So angle, angle, side. So now, because we've shown the triangles are congruent, we can say the sides are congruent. KR is congruent to MP because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles congruent. Let's see, we'll just redo this one. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right. So that takes me to your worksheet. And on your worksheet, the first question says, write the 6 statements that can be supported by corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So, I know that you have the even ones for homework, so I'm going to be doing the odd ones, but in this particular section, I'm just going to do them all. So we'll start with the sides. GA is congruent to DE, and AR is congruent to EN, and GR is congruent to DN. Angle G is congruent to angle D. Angle A is congruent to angle E. And angle R is congruent to angle N. So those would be the 6 statements that could be supported by corresponding parts of congruent triangles congruent. Okay, so now let's jump down to the next number, 7. So it says, on number 7, name the triangles you might try to prove congruent in order to prove each of the following. But we want to say that NM is congruent to NO. So the triangles we would be looking at would be MNE, so triangle MNE, and triangle ONL. Okay. That takes me to number 9. On number 9, we're trying to prove that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So to do that, we would need to look at triangle EOL. It would have to be congruent to triangle LME. Alright, so you're left with number 8 for homework. On number 11, you're asked to supply the reasons, so the first statement obviously is AC is congruent to BC. That's given. I would put in here CD, ray CD bisects angle ACB, which would be given. Alright, so we have that AC is congruent to BC. We have that CD bisects ACB. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And they skipped that. So we're going to make this 2A. They said angle 1 was congruent to angle 2. And this would be definition of angle bisector. Then they said CD is congruent to CD, and the reason for that would be reflexive. So next we have that triangle ACD is congruent to triangle BCD. And the reason for that, well, it's one of those 5 ways, so let's go back. Side, angle, side. So the reason is side, angle, side. And look at what you wrote down. You have a side, an angle, and a side. So side, angle, side. And then now we can say that AD is congruent to BD. Alright? And the reason would be corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So the next one that we have is number 13. Here's another picture that's stuck together. Like I said, sometimes it's easier to pull these apart. So you have A, X, Y, and you have X, B, Y. So the first thing you're given is that angle A is congruent to angle B. That is given. Mark it on your picture. The next thing we're given, which I don't have it up here, this is 2 and this is 1. So this is 2 and this is 1. This is A and this is B. You have angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And that's given. They put it all on one line, guys. Number 3, XY is congruent to XY. And that would be what property? The reflexive property. So this piece is equal to that piece. So you have an angle, and a side. So we're going to say that angle, and a side. So we're going to say that triangle AXY is congruent to triangle BYX. And this reason we've already given was angle, side. So now we can say AX is congruent to BY using corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So once again, you have to prove the triangles are congruent before you can say that any parts are congruent. So you have to prove the triangles are congruent before you say this. Okay? All right. That takes me down to number 15, which is the last one that I'm going to do. Once again, look at what you're trying to prove. You're trying to prove on number 16 that the parts of the triangle are congruent. So you've got to prove the triangles are congruent first before you can do that. So our given information is AX is congruent to BX. We'll make that number 1 given. We know that angle C is congruent to angle D. That's also given. Let's go back and mark it on our paper. So we have AX is congruent to BX. We have angle C is congruent to angle D. And what do we know about angles 1 and 2? What kind of angles are 1 and 2? Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 because they are vertical angles are congruent. So vertical angles congruent. So we have this angle is congruent to that angle. So we have an angle, and a side. So we have an angle, and a side. Oh. Angle, and a side. So we can say that triangle AXC is congruent to triangle BXD. Alright, from there we can say AC is congruent to BD because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles congruent. So for homework, you want to go back and do the even ones that we have not done on the worksheet for homework.